The first thing Dale Whitfield sold after losing his job was his father's pocket watch, not because he'd stopped caring about where it came from. He sold it because the water company had shut off service to his house, and his daughter needed to bathe before school pictures. That was in September. 4 months later, with almost everything else gone too, Dale did something that made no sense to anyone who'd known him for the last 15 years. He bought a failing diner off Route 9 outside Dayton, Ohio, a place with a cracked neon sign and a parking lot full of weeds pushing through the asphalt. If you believe people can rebuild after everything falls apart, stay with this one to the end. Dale had spent 13 years at Corrigan Freight Lines, a mid-sized trucking and logistics company that moved auto parts and appliances across 4 states. He started as a night dispatcher answering phones at 2 in the morning, half asleep, learning the geography of Ohio and Indiana one dispatch call at a time. He worked his way up slowly, first to shift supervisor, then to regional operations manager, a title that sounded bigger than the office that came with it, a windowless room next to the break room that always smelled like microwaved leftovers. He was good at the parts of the job nobody noticed until they went wrong. He knew which drivers needed the daylight routes because of bad knees or bad marriages. He knew which warehouse dock flooded every spring and needed sandbags before the first thaw. He could look at a manifest and catch a misplaced decimal point before it turned into a 6-figure mistake, sitting quietly in a spreadsheet, waiting to explode on someone else's desk. He kept a battered green ledger in the cab of whatever truck he happened to be riding along in, because he trusted his own handwriting more than he trusted the company's new routing software. And more than once that ledger had saved somebody their job when the system logged a delivery wrong. At 41, Dale wasn't wealthy, but he'd built something steady, brick by brick, the way you build things when you don't have room for mistakes. A rented house on Larkspur Street with a crooked porch step he kept meaning to fix and never did. An old Chevy pickup with 200,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that had been on so long he'd stopped seeing it. Health insurance, decent enough that he didn't lie awake over it. Their daughter, Ruby, 8 years old, sharp-tongued and stubborn in a way that reminded him painfully of her mother, who thought his cooking was fine, in a tone that clearly meant it wasn't, but who never once complained about the peanut butter sandwiches he packed her for lunch, cut on the diagonal because she liked triangles better than rectangles, and he had learned, eventually, that this mattered. Stability mattered to Dale because 4 years earlier, his wife Colleen had died on a rain-slicked overpass on I-75, a semi-jackknifing in front of her in a storm nobody had predicted correctly, and since then he had learned to measure his life in small, dependable things instead of big ones, because big ones had betrayed him once already. Coffee at 5:15, black, no sugar, in the same chipped blue mug every morning. Ruby's mismatched socks, which he'd stopped trying to pair up because she liked them that way. The hallway light he left on all night, because she still didn't love waking up in complete darkness, and some fears you don't argue a child out of, you just leave the light on. Then Corrigan Freight Lines got a new CEO. Her name was Vanessa Cade. She was 36, direct in a way that made grown men nervous in meetings, and she'd been brought in by the board after turning around a struggling logistics firm outside Fort Wayne that everyone had assumed was finished. She showed up in plain gray blazers, carried her own coffee in a steel travel mug, and refused the corner office for the first month, working instead out of a folding table near the loading bays. She walked the warehouse floors before sunrise and asked drivers and loaders questions nobody in a suit had ever bothered asking them, things like which forklift kept sticking in reverse and whether the new schedule was actually working or just looked good on paper. Dale respected that at first. He'd spent 13 years watching executives who'd never touched a pallet jack make decisions about pallet jacks, and here was someone who at least seemed willing to learn the building before she rearranged it. But Corrigan was drowning, and no amount of walking the floor was going to bail out that kind of water. They'd lost their 2 biggest retail contracts the year before to a competitor with a newer fleet. Fuel costs had spiked twice in 18 months. A new automated sorting system, championed by the previous CEO and inherited by Vanessa like a debt she hadn't personally run up, had gone $3 million over budget and still misrouted packages often enough that 2 major clients had filed formal complaints. Within a month, Consultants filled the conference rooms with laptops and phrases like operational discipline and right-sizing the workforce, words that always seemed to mean the same thing no matter how many syllables they added to disguise it. Dale's division was told to cut costs by 15% inside one fiscal quarter. He spent 4 nights at his kitchen table after Ruby went to bed, working through every line of the budget with his green ledger open beside the laptop, and came back with a plan that cut 9% honestly, without touching anything that kept trucks safe on the road. The remaining 6%, he explained in the meeting, in front of Vanessa and 2 consultants, who'd been with the company less time than his truck had been running, would require eliminating overnight safety inspections on the fleet and cutting the maintenance crew that kept brakes and tires from failing on icy Ohio roads in January. He said it plainly. He believed, and said so out loud, that somebody would get hurt if they made that cut, and that the company would end up paying more in lawsuits and insurance claims than it would ever save in payroll. Vanessa disagreed. Not cruelly, she never once raised her voice at him, but with the flat certainty of someone who'd seen a dozen companies die slowly from exactly this kind of caution. Their final conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. Dale remembered the fluorescent light overhead, humming faintly, the kind of hum you only notice when a conversation is already going badly. He remembered a coffee ring on the printed budget between them and being bone-tired, because Ruby had spent half the previous night crying with an earache, and he'd sat up with her until 3, then come to work anyway because he didn't have sick days to spare. He remembered Vanessa's face, not cruel, just closed, like a door that had already decided which way it intended to swing before he'd finished his sentence. "You're protecting a system this company can't afford to keep running," she said. Dale answered sharper than he meant to, sharper than 13 years of loyalty should have allowed him to. "And you're cutting things you haven't been here long enough to understand." That sentence ended his career at Corrigan. Officially, his position was eliminated in a restructuring, a phrase that appeared on the paperwork, like it had nothing to do with anyone in particular. Unofficially, Dale knew exactly what he'd done. He'd made himself an easy name to circle on a list. Security walked him out that same afternoon, a young guard named Curtis who looked more uncomfortable about it than Dale did, carrying a cardboard box that held 2 coffee mugs, the green ledger, a framed photo of Ruby at her 4th birthday party with frosting on her nose, and a small potted cactus from his desk that would be dead within the month, which, looking back, felt about right. He figured he'd find something else within a few weeks. He was wrong. His experience was too specialized for entry-level warehouse jobs, and too senior, meaning, in practice, too expensive, for anyone hiring at a level he could actually get an interview for. One logistics company in Columbus put him through 3 rounds of interviews, background check included, before sending a rejection email that misspelled his last name. Another offered him a position 2 hours north with rotating night shifts, decent pay on paper, and Dale sat in the parking lot of that interview doing math on his phone, gas for the drive, a babysitter he couldn't really afford, the number of nights Ruby would fall asleep in someone else's house instead of her own bed, and turned it down before he even got home. The severance ran out faster than his spreadsheet had promised it would, the way money always does when you're the one watching it disappear. Rent on Larkspur Street, already tight since Colleen's hospital bills had eaten into their savings years before her death, became genuinely impossible by December. Dale cancelled the streaming subscriptions first, then the gym membership he hadn't used in months anyway, then sold his good tools at a pawn shop off Wayne Avenue, keeping only the basics he needed to fix the truck himself when it inevitably needed fixing. He stopped buying anything that wasn't reduced for quick sale at the grocery store, checking expiration dates like a man diffusing something. Ruby noticed more than he wanted her to, the way kids always notice more than adults give them credit for. She stopped asking to stop for ice cream on Fridays after swim practice, not because he'd told her they couldn't, but because she'd apparently decided on her own that asking wasn't fair to him anymore, and that quiet decision broke something in Dale worse than any Bill ever had. At the grocery store one Sunday, he watched her put a box of the good cereal back on the shelf after checking the price tag, thinking he hadn't seen her do it, replacing it with the store brand, without a word of complaint. He had to walk to the end of the aisle and stand there for a minute before he trusted his own voice. One evening in late January, Dale found a permission slip for a class field trip to the Science Museum, crumpled at the bottom of the kitchen trash can, The $30 fee circled twice like Ruby had stared at it a long time before deciding it wasn't worth mentioning. That was the week Dale sold the pocket watch, the one his father had carried through 20 years on the assembly line at a since-closed transmission plant before pressing it into Dale's hand the week he turned 18, saying almost nothing, the way his father said almost everything. Dale sat in his truck outside the pawn shop on 3rd Street afterward for a long time, turning his bare wrist over like it belonged to somebody else, and did not cry, though it cost him something to manage that. By late January, the landlord had begun eviction proceedings, patient about it in the way of someone who'd done this before, and knew exactly how the paperwork worked. Dale and Ruby moved into a small 2-room apartment above a laundromat in a stretch of town called Fairgrove, where the entire building shuddered gently every time the industrial dryers hit their spin cycle. Ruby said it felt like living on a boat, and laughed when she said it, a real laugh, and Dale laughed too because she wanted him to, and then he went and locked himself in the bathroom until his face stopped doing whatever it had started doing on its own. The diner came into his life because of a flat tire. One grey, sleeting morning in February, on his way to another interview that would go nowhere the way most of them had lately, Dale pulled off Route 9 to change a blown tire on the shoulder and noticed across the road a squat brick building with a hand-lettered sign taped crookedly inside the front window. For sale. Inquire within. Half the neon letters on the sign above the door had burned out or given up entirely, so what remained read, Way ans die ner, against a sky the color of old dishwater. He finished changing the tire, and then, instead of driving onto an interview he already half expected to lose, he crossed the road. Inside, an old man named Walt Braddock was on his knees in front of an ancient walk-in cooler, trying to force a stripped bolt loose with a wrench 2 sizes too small, muttering at the machine like it owed him money and had been avoiding him for years. The diner had opened in 1971, built by Walt's parents with money borrowed from 3 different relatives who'd all doubted it would last a decade. It had lasted 5. Walt's wife had run the register and the small talk for 30 years until arthritis in her hip made standing behind a counter unbearable. Their son had moved to Phoenix for a job in real estate and wanted absolutely nothing to do with grease traps, walk-in coolers, or a building older than the interstate that ran past it. Walt had been trying to sell for nearly 2 years, and in that time exactly one serious buyer had come and gone, a chain that wanted the land but not the diner and planned to bulldoze it for a drive-through. Dale had no earthly business buying a diner. He told Walt as much, standing there in his coat still damp from the sleet. Then he came back the next morning anyway, and again on Saturday, and by the following week he'd started asking questions instead of just looking around. About the supplier for the eggs, about why the coffee tasted the way it did, about the 6 items on the menu, and why there were only 6. He'd spent 13 years moving other people's food across 4 states in refrigerated trailers, watching numbers on a screen. But this was different in a way he couldn't fully name. A breakfast plate with 3 eggs and hash browns, a meatloaf special on Thursdays that regulars apparently planned their week around, pie that Walt insisted, with real conviction, should never under any circumstances be refrigerated because the cold ruined the crust. The place smelled like scorched coffee and bacon grease, and something underneath that reminded Dale, uncomfortably and specifically, of his grandmother's kitchen in a way he hadn't let himself think about in years. The numbers, when Walt finally showed them to him, were ugly. The roof leaked steadily over the back booth, bad enough that Walt kept a bucket there permanently. The walk-in cooler ran non-stop and still couldn't hold temperature reliably in summer. The griddle was older than Dale was, but the diner still had regulars, a small, loyal, stubborn handful of them. A night shift nurse named Denise came in every morning at 6 sharp for eggs over easy and rye toast, still in her scrubs, barely speaking until the 2nd cup of coffee. 2 mechanics from the tire shop next door split a slice of pie after closing up most evenings, arguing amiably about high school football from 20 years ago. A retired schoolteacher named Ida bought a bag of day-old rolls twice a week, ostensibly for the birds in her backyard, though Dale would come to suspect most of them never made it that far. Walt offered a deal no bank in Ohio would have approved. A small down payment, most of what remained of Dale's retirement account after the severance ran dry, followed by monthly payments made directly to Walt over 6 years, no interest, an arrangement built entirely on an old man's judgment of another man's face. The 2-bedroom apartment above the diner came with the building, in need of real repair but livable enough. Dale stared at the contract on his kitchen table for 3 days, doing math that never quite worked no matter how he arranged it, and signed it anyway on a Tuesday, because the alternative, waiting for a call that clearly wasn't coming, had stopped feeling like a plan at all. The first year was rough in ways Dale hadn't let himself anticipate. He burned an entire tray of hash browns during his second week because Ruby's school called about a stomachache in the middle of the breakfast rush, and he forgot the timer entirely, standing in the school office parking lot while smoke rolled out the diner's back door 2 miles away. He underestimated how fast bacon prices climbed that spring and ate the difference out of his own pocket, rather than raise the price on regulars who counted their change at the register. A pipe froze and burst in March, flooding half the kitchen at 4 in the morning, and Dale spent 6 hours with a wet vac and a space heater, instead of sleeping before the breakfast crowd arrived. His first attempt at biscuits came out so dense that Ruby knocked one against the counter twice, listened to the sound it made, and asked with total sincerity if they could use it to prop the back door open instead of throwing it away. He kept it in a drawer for a month as a joke that stopped being funny and became somehow sentimental. He woke at 4 every morning, sometimes earlier. Ruby did her homework at the sticky booth nearest the register, headphones clamped over her ears, mostly ignoring the regulars who tried, gently and repeatedly, to draw her into conversation about school, or boys, or whether she liked math, which she did fiercely, though she'd never have admitted it to a stranger. Dale watched cooking videos on his phone after midnight, with the sound turned low so it wouldn't carry through the thin apartment walls, and scribbled what he learned into the same green ledger he'd carried out of Corrigan in a cardboard box, notes about proofing times and griddle temperatures crowding the margins, next to old dispatch schedules he never got around to tearing out. He kept Walt's recipes mostly untouched. The old man had made him promise that much, half joking, half not. But slowly, carefully, he reshaped the business around the edges. He added a call-ahead order line using a prepaid flip phone taped to the wall by the register. He started supplying dinner rolls to the auto shop next door for their break room, a small account that barely covered the flour, but kept a relationship alive that would matter later. He cut 3 items off the menu that looked appealing on paper, but that nobody in 6 months of watching had actually ordered more than twice. Mostly, though, he listened, the same way he'd once listened to drivers complain about routes nobody else bothered asking about. When Ida mentioned, almost in passing, that the coffee was too weak for her taste but far too strong for her husband's ulcer, Dale started brewing 2 separate pots every morning instead of 1, decaf on the back burner, and never made a thing of it. When a construction crew started resurfacing the overpass nearby that summer, working shifts that started before dawn, Dale began opening 45 minutes earlier to catch them on their way in, standing at the griddle in the dark, with the lights not fully on yet. When the shelter 2 blocks over, run out of a converted church basement, asked hesitantly whether he might have anything left over at closing, Dale said yes immediately, and then spent weeks after that learning to plan his ordering more precisely, not so there'd be less to give away, but so the giving wouldn't just be an excuse to stop caring about waste in the first place. By the second year, the diner, which Dale had finally repainted with a simple new sign reading Whitfield's, after the old burned-out neon finally gave out completely, wasn't dying anymore. It wasn't thriving either, not by any measure that would have impressed a bank. Dale still lay awake some nights running quarterly tax numbers in his head, instead of sleeping. The walk-in cooler groaned ominously every few weeks, like it was actively considering retirement. He still, more often than he liked to admit even to himself, moved money quietly from his own thin checking account to make sure payroll cleared on time. But he'd hired 2 part-time cooks, a college kid named Marcus and a woman named Sherry who'd waited tables longer than Dale had been alive, fixed the leak over the back booth for good, and Ruby, 10 now and sharper than ever, had appointed herself the diner's unofficial and entirely unpaid quality control, rejecting with real authority anything she felt was trying too hard for a place like this. Then on a wet Tuesday afternoon in November, 3 years almost to the week since the flat tire that had started everything, Vanessa Cade walked through the front door. Dale was behind the counter, portioning pie filling into steel bowls. Flour dusted across one sleeve of his flannel shirt. Ruby sat in the corner booth, working through long division, picking absently at the crust of a leftover biscuit, headphones around her neck instead of over her ears for once. The bell over the door jingled the way it always did, ordinary, and Dale looked up out of habit and went completely still. Vanessa looked different from how he remembered her. Her hair longer now, tired shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there 3 years earlier when she'd walked warehouse floors before sunrise like she owned the sunrise itself. She carried a leather bag and a dripping umbrella, and she glanced around the diner with the faint, searching expression of someone unsure she'd walked into the right building at all. Ruby looked between them, sensing something in the air before she understood what it was. "Dad?" Dale wiped his hands on his apron, slowly, buying himself half a second. "Ms. Cade." Something in Vanessa's face tightened at the formality, a small flinch she didn't quite manage to hide. She hadn't known, she explained, that the diner belonged to him. Her car had broken down at the garage across the road, and the mechanic, an old-timer who apparently knew everyone within 5 miles, had pointed her toward Whitfield's for coffee while she waited on a part. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Dale could hear the walk-in cooler compressor kick on in the back, and Denise, 2 stools down, quietly stopped chewing. He could have told her to leave. For one sharp, clean second, some old, unhealed part of him wanted to. Instead, he reached for a chipped white mug, filled it with coffee from the pot Ida preferred, and set it on the counter in front of her without a word. "Coffee's $1.75, he said. Nothing dramatic happened. She paid in exact change, counted out carefully like she'd rehearsed it in the car. She sat at the small table by the window for 20 minutes, barely touching the cup, and Dale, trying and mostly failing not to watch her, noticed her gaze moving slowly around the room, over the regulars, over Ruby's math homework, over the handwritten call-ahead orders clipped to a string by the register. When she finally stood to leave, she gave him a small, careful nod on her way out, and he didn't return it. She came back the following week. This time she ordered coffee and a slice of pie, and stayed even longer. Then she came again a few days after that, and again the week after. Dale found himself irritated by the visits in a way he couldn't entirely justify, not out loud, not even to himself. He suspected, uncharitably, that she wanted something from him. An absolution, maybe, or a story she could carry home and tell herself about how the man she'd fired had landed on his feet after all, something that would make her own decision easier to live inside of. On her 4th visit, on a Thursday afternoon with the diner nearly empty, Dale finally set down his rag and asked her directly, "Why do you keep coming back here?" Vanessa looked down at the coffee cup in her hands for a long moment before she answered, and the answer was not the one Dale had braced himself for. Corrigan Freight Lines, she told him, was closing one of its 2 main terminals. The automated sorting system had never worked the way it had been promised to, not once, not for a single quarter. The company had borrowed further trying to fix it, lost a second major contract in the process, and was now preparing to lay off more than 90 people, drivers and dock workers and dispatchers, some of whom Dale had trained personally back when he still had the standing to train anyone. Vanessa had spent 2 years trying to keep the company afloat, she said, and had failed in ways that didn't reduce neatly into a quarterly earnings call. She told him that months after firing him, alone in her office late one night, she'd gone back through internal safety reports she'd had no real reason to reread. 2 documented brake failures on trucks running the routes he'd flagged. A near collision on an icy overpass. Not the one that had killed Colleen, a different one, though the coincidence still sat wrong in Dale's stomach when he heard it. That had made it into an insurance claims file, but never into any headline. Delivery delays month after month that had ultimately cost the company more in contractual penalties than the entire maintenance crew's salary would have run in a year. "I thought you were resisting change," she said quietly, not looking up from the mug. "I was resisting bad math," Dale said. He didn't forgive her on the spot, standing there with a rag still in one hand. He didn't tell her it was fine, because it hadn't been, and pretending otherwise would have cheapened 4 months that still lived somewhere under his ribs whenever he let himself remember them clearly. He told her plainly about the apartment above the laundromat and the dryer cycles that shook the floor, About the interview 2 hours north he'd turned down doing math in a parking lot. About the crumpled permission slip in the trash can. He did not mention the pocket watch, and that one still felt like his to carry alone, at least for now. His voice stayed level throughout, careful. But Vanessa listened without once interrupting him, without once reaching for an excuse to soften what she was hearing. When he finished, she said only that she was sorry. Just that, unadorned, no explanation built around it to make it easier for her to say. Dale nodded once and went back to the pie filling. For several weeks after that, they spoke little beyond ordinary counter-conversation. Orders, weather, the price of gas. But she kept coming, twice a week, then 3 times. Slowly, in pieces, Dale learned that she had resigned from Corrigan before the terminal closure was even made public, walking away from a retention bonus that would have covered a year of expenses, and was instead spending her days, unpaid and mostly unthanked, trying to connect the soon-to-be laid-off drivers and dock workers with other logistics companies hiring across the region. She wasn't secretly broke, and she wasn't quietly angling to buy her way into Whitfield's, the way Dale had half suspected in his more suspicious moments. She was, as far as he could tell, simply a woman whose career had once moved faster than her judgment, and who had started late and painfully to understand the real weight of decisions that got made from behind a desk on the 3rd floor, decisions that landed, eventually, on people standing at ground level who never got a vote. One grey afternoon in early December, she asked almost carefully whether he needed help finding wholesale accounts, restaurants or coffee shops that might want a regular supplier for pies or rolls. Dale's first answer was no, flat and immediate. 2 days later, the walk-in cooler finally gave out for good, dying overnight with a shudder that woke Dale upstairs at 3 in the morning. The repair estimate, when the refrigeration guy finally called back, came to $5,200, more cash than Dale had seen in one place since he'd signed Walt's contract. He sat alone in the diner after closing that night, phone screen glowing in the dark, staring at the number like it might change if he looked at it long enough. He had enough barely for payroll or for the repair deposit, not both. Ruby was asleep upstairs, the hallway light left burning the way it always was. Rain tapped steadily against the front windows, the same rain that had been falling the day Vanessa first walked back into his life. The next morning, before he'd fully decided to, Dale called her. He didn't ask for money and made that clear before she could offer any. He asked instead if she knew of anyone, any small business, any local chain, looking for a steady supplier of pies and rolls. Vanessa made 3 calls that same afternoon. 2 went nowhere. The third led to a woman named Priya Anand, who ran a small chain of 3 coffee shops near the university and who tested Whitfield's pies personally, twice a week, for an entire month, without a single promise made either way, before finally agreeing to a standing weekly order that wasn't a fortune but was steady. And steady was worth more to Dale right then than almost anything else on earth. It financed a refurbished walk-in cooler, bought second-hand from a closing restaurant across town, and kept both Marcus and Sherry on the schedule through the slow winter months when the diner's own foot traffic usually thinned out. Months later, almost by accident, Dale learned that Vanessa had never pressured Priya, had never oversold him or exaggerated a single thing about the diner's numbers. She'd simply told Priya, in one short phone call, that his food was good and that he showed up on time every time, which was true, and which mattered to Dale more than he was entirely comfortable admitting out loud, even to himself, standing alone in the kitchen at 4 in the morning with nobody around to hear him admit it. The relationship between Dale and Vanessa never became simple, and Dale came to understand slowly that it wasn't supposed to. Some wounds don't close just because the person who caused them turns out eventually to be kinder than the worst version of her he'd carried around in his head for a year. There were still days he watched her sit by the window with her coffee and remembered with total clarity carrying that cardboard box through Corrigan's lobby with a security guard half a step behind him, like he might steal something on his way out the door after 13 years of loyalty. There were also days she stayed 20 minutes past closing, sleeves pushed up, helping Sherry stack chairs because Marcus had gone home sick with the flu, or sat across from Ruby at the corner booth walking her patiently through a long division problem while she waited for a pie to finish cooling. People are inconvenient that way, Dale came to think, standing at the griddle some mornings turning that idea over slowly, the way he once turned over dispatch problems. They can hurt you and mean it at the time. They can regret it later, genuinely, and still not be able to undo a single day of what it cost you. They can be wrong without being monsters, and you can forgive them if you choose to, not all at once in one clean gesture, but slowly in pieces, entirely on your own schedule, and owe no one an explanation for how long it takes. 3 years after Dale signed Walt's contract at his kitchen table, Walt himself came in on a Saturday morning in late spring and found every booth full and a line stretching almost to the door, people waiting patiently in the thin morning sun for a table. The old man stood by the pie case for a long time, with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, trying and failing completely to look unimpressed, blinking hard once or twice in a way he didn't explain, and Dale didn't ask about. Dale still wasn't rich, not by any stretch. He still woke before 5 most mornings out of habit more than necessity now. The roof still leaked once, memorably, during a bad spring storm that flooded the same back booth all over again, and Ruby, old enough now to braid her own hair competently, still complained about his cooking, though with noticeably less conviction than she once had, and sometimes, when she thought he wasn't listening, told her friends it was actually pretty good. But the diner employed 6 people now, counting the 2 high schoolers he'd taken on for weekend shifts. The apartment upstairs had entirely new plumbing, installed by a contractor Vanessa had connected him with, who'd given him a fair price and no lecture about it. Dale had started cautiously, tentatively, putting a little money back into a retirement account for the first time in 4 years, small amounts, but consistent, the way Walt's payments had always been. One evening in early June, sweeping flour from beneath the counter after closing, with the radio playing low and the parking lot empty outside, Ruby asked him, out of nowhere, whether he was glad he'd gotten fired. Dale stopped sweeping. He thought about the house on Larkspur Street they'd lost, the pocket watch sitting in some stranger's display case, the months of fear that used to sit in his chest like a stone he carried without setting down, the humiliation of calling his sister in Cincinnati to ask quietly for gas money he never quite managed to pay back on the timeline he'd promised. He thought about Walt on his knees fighting a stripped bolt with the wrong wrench, the burnt hash browns, the biscuit dense enough to prop open a door, the rainy Tuesday afternoon Vanessa had walked back into his life carrying an umbrella that hadn't done her a single bit of good in the end. "No," he said finally, "but I'm glad it didn't get to keep me down." That was the closest thing to a real answer he had, and Ruby seemed to accept it, the way she accepted most things lately, with a small nod and no further questions, going back to her long division at the corner booth, like the conversation had never happened. Though Dale suspected she'd remember it longer than she let on. A few weeks later, on a quiet evening just before closing, Vanessa came in one last time before she left town. She'd accepted a job, she told him, consulting for a small family-owned distribution company 2 states over, a smaller title than she'd ever held before, less authority, and as she put it herself, considerably more listening than talking, which she said like it was a discipline she was still learning rather than a demotion she was quietly resenting. She set a plain manila envelope on the counter between them, unmarked, and slid it toward him without ceremony. Inside was something worth exactly nothing to anyone but Dale. His old green ledger, the one he'd left behind 3 years earlier on the day security walked him out. The one he'd assumed was long gone, thrown out with everything else in that cleared-out office. It had sat forgotten, apparently, in a storage cabinet at Corrigan's main office for years, misfiled among old maintenance logs, until Vanessa found it while packing up her own desk for the last time. The pages inside were exactly as he remembered them. Route notes, maintenance warnings, driver schedules scrawled in his own cramped handwriting, small personal reminders crowded into the margins alongside the professional ones. Near the bottom of one water-stained page, written years before any of this had happened, back when Ruby was small enough to still need reminding about dentist appointments, was a note to himself in his own hand. Ruby, Dentist Thurs. Don't forget again. Dale laughed out loud when he saw it, a real laugh, the first one that had surprised out of him in longer than he could easily place. For a moment, he simply held the ledger, running his thumb along the cracked spine, feeling the soft, worn edges of pages he'd forgotten he'd ever written. Vanessa stood on the other side of the counter, not saying anything, waiting for nothing in particular, just letting him have the moment. "Thank you," Dale said, and meant it fully, and realized, somewhat to his own surprise, that it was the first time he had thanked her for anything since the day she'd first walked back through that door with a dripping umbrella and a face full of shadows he hadn't understood yet. After she left that evening, the bell over the door falling quiet behind her, Dale flipped the sign to closed and checked the ovens twice, the way he always did, out of a habit that had become something closer to a small prayer. Upstairs, Ruby had music playing too loud while she finished the last of her homework, the floor above him vibrating faintly with the bass, the way it once had above the laundromat, though this time the sound belonged entirely to them. The diner smelled faintly of tomorrow's coffee, already brewing low for the morning crew, a habit Dale had picked up from Denise without ever quite meaning to. He set the old ledger carefully in the drawer beside the newer one he still carried with him every day, the two of them lying together now, years apart, but finally in the same place. He had once believed in the worst of it, that a life could come apart entirely in the space of a single afternoon, in one 20-minute meeting, under a humming fluorescent light, and for a long while afterward, his certainly had felt that way, unraveling further every week no matter what he did to stop it, but rebuilding it slowly, one burnt tray of hash browns and one repaired pipe at a time, had taught him something quieter than that fear, something that took years rather than minutes to understand. A second chance rarely arrives looking anything like rescue. Sometimes it looks like a flat tire on the shoulder of a state route outside a diner nobody else wanted. Sometimes it's a difficult apology, offered plainly, with no excuses built in around it to make it easier to say. Sometimes it's 3 phone calls made imperfectly by someone who is only just beginning to understand the size of the damage they caused, and is trying, clumsily but honestly, to repair some small corner of it. And sometimes kindness isn't about forgetting what happened at all, and was never meant to be. It's about deciding carefully, slowly, entirely on your own time, what you're going to do with everything that's still standing after. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. Comment below. Do you believe kindness can come back around even years later? I'd love to hear your story. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There's a new one every week.